Hello, everyone. Paul from Precision Hunting Supply. Thank you for joining me today on the Bloodline podcast. My guest today is Russ Jacoby, and we're going to be talking about the Dragon Bravo fire that is still actively burning on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. This is going to have an impact on the Kaibab units, and I think there's going to be a lot of interest out there from hunters about access and ability to hunt this year. I don't think there's anybody better to join us than Russ today. So thank you, Russ, so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about yourself. We'll get things kicked off.
Thanks for having me, Paul. I appreciate it. So my name is Russ Jacoby, and I'm an Arizona native. I'm in my mid 50s, so I've been around Arizona long enough to have spent quite a bit of time on the Kaibab. My family and I run an outfitting business on the Kaibab. We're very well known for the bison hunts in Arizona. We're probably less well known, but we do a lot of the other types of hunts in Arizona for all the big game animals in Arizona. We love Arizona. We live in Flagstaff, and it's heartbreaking to see the impact that fires can have on these communities and on the animals and the plants that are in these areas. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to talk about that. My family and I spend over 250 days a year on the Kaibab, so we're unique in that we are there a lot. We're there in deep snow before other people even consider hunting season. We're there all through the summer and into the fall. And, we have 20 years of history on the Kaibab to leverage. My formal training is chemical engineering. And so I do have a day job that keeps me very busy as well. But I think a lot of people in the hunting community know us for the time that we spend in the community and the things that we do there.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I think you're an expert on the area, and I sent a post to Hunting Arizona about 4 or 5 days ago asking, does anybody have any specific knowledge of this fire particularly, and of course the area. You were in the back of my mind, but I just wasn't sure, who the resident expert would be, but I'm glad we connected, and I'm glad we're here today to talk about it. So these are some of the best mule deer units in the world right here on the Kaibab. And there's going to be a lot of people who have waited a very, very long time to hunt in these units. And there's going to be a major impact to their hunt this year. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. We've just barely started the first hunt of the year here with the archery deer hunt that opened this most recent Friday.
Yeah.
And, there's obviously a big impact to those hunters in that the area that's open to the public to access is substantially smaller than it would otherwise be. And, the Forest Service has issued a map of where those boundaries are, and we can get into that in more detail. But generally speaking, some of the areas that the hunters like to focus on from the old historic burns is not accessible to the public, and that's already having an impact for the hunts that are happening right now. I know there's quite a few people that have waited a long time for this permit that got drawn this year that chose to use their point guard and put that tag back and hope for a better opportunity in the future. So it's definitely having an impact.
Yeah. I'm looking at a map here. I've been looking at several maps today in prep for this, and it looks like this is mostly 12A East, right? The west side also affected, but maybe by scale, half, maybe half of what's been impacted on the east side. So 12 West, 12A East, these are the two major hunt units affected. Am I right?
Correct. So the Dragon Bravo fire started in the park, just west of where the lodge was at. And unfortunately, as that fire proceeded, it started back on the 4th of July with a lightning strike. As it proceeded, very soon after that, within a week or so, it took out the lodge and a bunch of buildings. And as that fire moved north, it burned on both sides of Highway 67. As it approached the boundary between the Grand Canyon National Park and the Forest Service, the Kaibab National Forest, the fire crews were able to help push that fire to the east side of Highway 67. So an actual fire scar, if you're on the forest, which where most hunters are concerned because that's where they can legally hunt, it's focused mainly east of Highway 67 from the park boundary north until you get to the Warm Springs scar. But it does have an impact for hunters in 12A West because the Forest Service had to build firefighting infrastructure adjacent to the fire to be redundant backup and also to help the fire keep it from moving to the west. And so they haven't opened a large tract of land west of Highway 67 because they're not done with the cleanup operations from the fire.
Yeah, it probably goes without saying too that this is some of the most beautiful country in the state. This is some of the most beautiful forest in all of Arizona, and a lot of that has been lost.
Yeah.
So the fire started July 4th, like you said. It looks like the lightning strike was down in the canyon, right, in some real rugged country, and just kind of burnt up and across the top of that north rim. Did I have that right?
So the actual lightning strike, I'd have to look at the map, but it was real near the rim. I don't know if it was actually below the
Yeah,
rim or above the rim, but not so important.
yeah,
The original lightning strike happened, and there was a decision made at that point to fight that fire in a certain way. And there's some controversy surrounding, what was the terminology used to describe the fire at that time and what terminology is being used to describe the fire now. None of that matters. What matters, I think, to sportsmen and to most residents of Arizona is we're over 145,000 acres of areas that people love that are a fire scar now, and
yeah.
that's unfortunate.
What impact is it having on animal populations from what you can see? Our wildlife seems to be pretty resilient when it comes to fires, even big fires like this. But the bison, in particular, that you know a lot about, the mule deer, of course. Like what do you think the impact is going to be?
So we get a lot of questions about that, and obviously there's a spectrum here of concern. I had people calling me that were just convinced that the buffalo all just got ate up in the fire and burnt to the ground, and we don't believe that happened. All of the information that we have from boots on the ground, because it's not accessible to the public, I haven't physically been in there, so we're gleaning information from the sources that we have available to us, is that we don't know of any herds of ungulates, whether we're talking bison or deer, that were physically burnt by the fire. If you look at the distance the fire traveled, you're looking 20, 30 miles type scales that we're talking about here, depending on which dimensions you're measuring. And it burnt for 6 weeks roughly. And if you do the math, there certainly were days where it moved a little faster or a little slower, but it wasn't the type of fire that was going to outpace a large animal's ability to run away from that
Sure.
fire.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Long-term impacts, it's actually beneficial to wildlife to have better feed sources available to them with the different forbs and grasses that will come back into those areas. But there's smaller animals that are probably more impacted. I think most sportsmen are more concerned about the larger animals, but there are sportsmen that pursue the grouse, they pursue the kaibab squirrels and some other
Squirrel. Yeah.
creatures that they're
Sure.
known for. And certainly there's an impact to those types of animals. Um, Surprisingly, I think a lot of those animals are able to move away from the fire, but their homes are destroyed, and what does that mean for them in this coming winter and things
Yeah.
like that? But there's untold numbers of other wildlife, from little tiny ones to little bit larger ones that are definitely impacted by a fire like this.
Yeah.
But the takeaway that I'd like most sportsmen to understand is that the wildlife themselves have survived and survived quite well in most cases, although there are smaller animals that are probably more impacted. Things like the Merriam's turkey on the Kaibab, those are popular quarry for a lot of hunters. And I get a lot of text messages and phone calls from Facebook and firefighters, but also sportsmen that are traveling in the areas that you can access. And they're like, Russ, why are there so many turkeys? Well, if you think about it, you have a fire scar of 145,000 acres. The turkeys that were in that fire scar are now displaced, and they're going to cause a higher concentration in the other areas. And so there's that initial impact of lots of sightings of critters that are maybe in areas they wouldn't normally be this time of year, or maybe in densities in those areas that you wouldn't expect them to be. But that's good to see. It's good to see that the turkeys were able to move away. We saw a lot of mama turkeys with poults that were running around and traveling and doing quite well. And we're getting some rains. I'm sure we'll get into the impact that has with erosion concerns and so on, but it certainly can precipitate some new growth that things like turkey poults are definitely going to benefit from.
Yeah, well, we know, right? Most all sportsmen, hunters know the benefits to wildlife, fires. And in fact, the Kaibab is a great story of where some slobs have been taken out of the burn in the last however many years it's been, 15 or whatever it's been, long time.
Certainly.
So this will eventually be a good thing, I think, right? I think people will agree that this will be a good thing for deer habitat, and buffalo will return at some point, but um, I don't want to overstate that, but I assume, right, that this will end up like most wildfires in Arizona, be a good thing for the forest and a good thing for the wildlife. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I believe so. If you look at past fires as a comparison, um, when the fires are extinguished and then over the intervening years afterwards, they'll bounce back with different types of growth that are actually provide more feed and things for wildlife than the mature forest would. So it'll have that impact. Um, these landscapes should be fire resistant, and our decades of fire suppression create a landscape where that's different. And so the mosaic fires that can be beneficial to wildlife but maintain mature trees weren't as likely in this type of a landscape. So the impacts are different. For people that are familiar with what they call the burn on the Kaibab, we're usually talking about the Warm Springs fire scar, and that's 15 miles or so south of Jacobs Lake. And those areas where these large mature deer are taken and harvested, and that everyone's dreams are made of, they benefit from those landscapes that are damaged by fire. And no doubt the Dragon Bravo scar will do the same thing. It'll create a landscape where the deer will have much better feed than they otherwise would have.
This map I'm looking at right here suggests the Warm Fire was in '06, so that's 19 years ago.
Yeah,
But yeah, been a very beneficial fire for mule deer habitat and for growing some
sure.
giants. So what else do you have for us? What else do you have for us on the report from the North Rim, and what's going on up there? What do hunters and sportsmen need to know this season? So as you indicated, there's already an archery hunt going on. There are closures, so hunters are being affected right now. But the guys are going to be coming in October, November. I know you can't predict the future, but access, egress, what should guys expect when they're coming up here this year? And you also mentioned point guard. I don't remember if that was online or offline, but a lot of guys are wondering, is this the year that I point guard my tag? Give me your 2 cents.
Sure. There's a lot of ground to cover there. I get a lot of phone calls. Russ, what should I do with my tag? Should I keep it? Should I get rid of it? And what I encourage hunters to do is get involved and get educated of what areas are open and what areas are closed and the impact that it has on your specific unit. There's good resources available with Game and Fish Department and also with the Kaibab National Forest online, but you can also contact those agencies directly and talk to them. But generally speaking, 12A East is completely shut down right now. 12A West, maybe half-ish is closed. So
Mm-hmm.
there are areas available for hunters to hunt, but a lot of hunters that were wanting to hunt that closed area have already used point guard and already turned their tags in. For the hunters that are hunting, I do think there are opportunities there. So I think a lot of it depends on what were the hunter's wishes and desires. As we look forward, what does it mean in October? What does it mean in November? It seems unlikely that the closure area will stay the same size that it is now for those later seasons, but that's going to be dependent on the repairs that are happening by the Forest Service and the other agencies that are working to, clean this up. So a good example, if we can take some examples to help hunters understand what's going to happen and maybe guess what might it look like for their season, let's just talk about Highway 67. As a government agency, they can't just open Highway 67 and turn everybody loose on Highway 67. Well, why not? Well, you scorched one side of that road, and there's trees, hazard trees there. They're going to fall and block the road. So they've got literally dozens of miles of road that they've got to go through and remove hazard trees and the debris that's associated with that. Um, even outside of the fire scar, I get a lot of questions, hunters asking, well, why is the boundary so far away from the fire scar? What you have to realize is that they were putting in dozer lines and other barriers to spread of the fire as contingencies if the fire was to spread in other directions. And they can't just turn the public loose in those areas. They need to come through, clear out roads, and take those dozer lines and things like that and put them in a more natural state. And there's dozens of miles of that that has to be completed. And that doesn't happen overnight. But, if you're looking a month into the future or 2 months into the future, the areas are going to be reclaimed. And as that happens, I would anticipate that they're going to open up more and more areas to the hunters. But that depends on how quickly they're able to complete this. And it also depends a little bit on how hunters behave. It's probably not a surprise that some hunters will violate the closures, and that can create a situation where they may leave closures in place longer to have a bigger buffer and barrier to where they need to operate to keep the public back. And so their ability to open areas is going to maybe be hampered by the behavior of people that visit those areas. And certainly it's not just sportsmen or hunters, it's other forest visitors. But that's going to be weighing into the equation, so to speak, of how they're going to think about what areas they can or can't open. So for deer hunts, like, you'll know before your hunt starts which areas are open, and you'll need to look at that and make a personal determination for yourself if it's worth being there or not. I'm hopeful that we'll have areas available to the hunters that they're going to want to hunt, but certainly there's going to be big impacts, and how big those impacts are is a little bit of a guessing game of how much of that area they open up and when they open it up. There are public meetings that can be attended. We've attended every one of those, and we would encourage the sportsmen to get involved. The more voices that are there involved in talking about it, the more education there's going to be to the general public, but also perhaps it might lessen the impact to hunters and on their hunts. And of course, I can't answer millions of phone calls, but we do take lots and lots of phone calls and text messages. Reach out to us. Anything that we can do to try to provide information to folks, we're happy to do that. And Paul, I know we talked about, we have a Facebook forum specifically for the bison hunters, but it's not meant to be just for the bison hunters. We do that because that's where we spend the majority of our time. But if you get on there, and it'll be linked in Paul's information with the podcast, there's a lot of helpful information on there for folks where they can see the maps, they can see the links to the Fire Facebook page, to the Kaibab, and to the Game and Fish. Any information that's released to the public, we do our very best to post that immediately and explain what that means to the hunters and answer any questions that folks have. Just in the last 2 weeks, we've gotten lots of questions from antelope hunters that were affected by the fire, as well as archery deer hunters affected by the fire. And it's great that you can go to those agencies and get information from them, but we want to try to be able to be a resource that speaks the language that hunters speak and maybe help them understand, like, hey, my trailer's 40 foot long. How do I get it to this area? That's not something you're going to find on a website, but we've driven those roads. We know what they look like, and we can tell you, like, hey, I would camp here or I wouldn't camp there. And we'll answer as many of those questions as we can for folks. What I can say in the podcast is the primary access for most folks is going to be using a 22 road up past Big Springs and branching out from there. There are surface roads available that travel from Jacobs Lake down towards Timp Point, and all those surface roads in that general area are open for the most part. But a lot of those roads are maybe not conducive to access with things like a toy hauler. And even if they are, you're probably going to find it quicker to travel over to Fredonia and bring the 22 road back up onto the Kaibab. Okay. In the House Rock Valley, which affects the antelope hunt right now, but will affect, hunters with like 12A East permits in the future. When you look at the House Rock Valley south of 89A, the land that is BLM land is currently open, and the land that is Forest Service land south of that, down towards the Buffalo Ranch and the Coxcombs and the Saddle Mountain Wilderness, that other land is closed. And the BLM land transition into Forest Service land is that boundary for that other closed area.
People who don't know, very diverse habitat, right? You're in the canyon, you're below the rim, kind of high desert, um, smaller fuels, but you get on top at 9,000 feet of elevation, very dense forest, very heavy fuels. As you go north and east, you kind of come out of that, right? You come off the mountain a little bit, you get down into some PJs again, into the grasslands. So that's what you're talking about. Down in that lower area, you've got antelope down there and some buffalo too. That's the captive herd, I think, that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so in the House Rock Valley, there's a captive herd of bison, and genetically they're different than the bison that are up on the plateau. So when the fire was going, they very much were concerned about buffalo from the top maybe getting displaced and mixing with that herd down below. That did not happen that we know of. Um, there was a time where they were worried about that herd, the captive herd in House Rock, being impacted by the fire. They actually had trucks available to truck those bison. The plan was to move them to the other game and fish property east of Flagstaff, the Raymond Ranch area. The firefighters worked very hard and were able to turn the fire and stop that from happening. But there was a couple days there. I know I talked to Sam Pogue. He's the wildlife manager there in that area, very concerned about having to move those bison and then not having to because the fire was able to be stopped.
Yeah.
And then as the fire burnt past that captive herd, they were able to prevent that. But certainly big impacts. Large tracts of land are closed. There's fire scars in there, and how much critters choose to utilize that fire scar is going to depend on a lot of things. For one, how much moisture we get, but for two, I know that we have shared a map that looked at the burn severity. That's just come out just in the last few days. And when you look at the burn severity, there's going to be some areas that are more of a mosaic where not all the large trees burnt. You'll have some large trees and some fire scar adjacent to each other in kind of a patchwork kind of way. But you're going to have other sections of the forest where it's decimated, more like the Warm Springs fire that people are familiar with. And animals like deer are probably going to utilize those areas differently, depending on how much moisture we may or may not get between now and those next upcoming hunts.
Yeah, the animals are pretty resilient, right? I've glassed. I'm sure many people have in fresh burns, still smoldering. Sometimes deer still, back in their feet, covered in soot, all black and whatnot. So pretty resilient. They'll be moving back in there, as it's still smoldering. So I anticipate in the years to come, it's going to be great mule deer habitat. I'm very sad that it burned off some beautiful forest that you just don't see. We don't have a lot of country above 9,000 feet in Arizona with that beautiful vegetation, those beautiful pine trees and that mix of conifer and deciduous. It's just a beautiful country, and some of that was lost, and that's sad. We also know that the Grand Canyon Lodge was lost there as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Um, it breaks my heart, and it's difficult for me to talk about it, actually. Our family has so many good memories there. It just hits you, you know.
Yeah,
But it happened, and it happened once before at the turn of the century, early on in the history of the lodge, and they rebuilt it. And so we support the efforts that the lodge will be rebuilt. And it's unfortunate that it happened, but you had a lightning strike fire that was west of the lodge, and that fire was being contained, is the words that they used. And that containment got away from them. As the fire traveled, it crossed some of the canyons near Dragon Head and burned over and took out the lodge and a bunch of other buildings with it. There is a bright spot, though. I don't know of any loss of life, and I think that's something to be aware of and to be thankful for. But as you're talking about, Paul, there's just old growth trees. It's almost like Canada in the mix of the types of conifers and other trees that you have there that you find that is special with the 9,000 feet of elevation. And that fire traveled across, burnt both sides of the highway 67 between the park boundary and the lodge, and then it traveled north. And that's tragic. The Park Service has closed the North Rim for the end of this season. And that has impact on uh, other forest users besides sportsmen. Sportsmen obviously care about that area, but they're not actively hunting that area because hunting is not allowed in the park. But, through hikers, the rim to rim community, and lots of other people that love these areas just as much as we do are all impacted. And on the social media platforms, there's lots of good information available out there about the impacts to that. And those impacts have far reaching implications that most people may not think about. So, one of the ones I'd like to talk about is the water system. Roaring Springs was very near to the fire and they fought very hard to protect it, and they did a good job doing that. But certainly, just because you didn't actually burn that infrastructure doesn't mean that infrastructure is not impacted. Up canyon from that infrastructure, you've had burns. And as we think about what happens after the berms and we get the monsoon season and the winter snows and rains, it can cause severe erosion that can travel down through those areas and cause problems. Specifically to the water system, that water system feeds the North Rim and the South Rim. Water is already a commodity and very difficult in this area, but if we lose that resource, then the impacts it have are going to be much, much greater and much more far reaching. There's a lot of local businesses that aren't just hunting related in communities like Fredonia and Kanab, but also on the South Rim that are all impacted by this. Tourism is severely impacted, and it's a huge part of the local economy. So anything that we can do to support those local businesses is valuable, or those businesses won't be there for us to rely on in the future. So I want to point out places like Jacob Lake. There's a gas station there, there's a store there, there's a restaurant there, there's a hotel there. And that's pretty much the infrastructure you have in that neck of the woods, so to speak. And stopping in there and getting a cookie or getting a shake or filling up your tank of gas there is really going to help them survive this storm that's going to affect their business. But as you travel further south, about halfway between Jacobs Lake and the entrance to the park is the Kaibab Lodge. And much like Jacobs Lake, there's a fuel station there. There's a gift shop. There's cabins, hotel type situation, and there's a restaurant. And supporting those businesses are going to be important if we want those businesses to be there when the forest bounce back and hunters are able to take advantage of some of the benefits of those burn areas and the impact that it will have in a positive way on the deer herd.
Yeah, that's a great point about all the local businesses and what a massive area to your point, the south side and the north side. So commercial businesses on the south side and the north side are being affected. I've got several friends that just happened to sneak in their rim to rim to rim before the fire started, thankfully, but major impact to businesses, as I'm sitting here listening to you thinking, yeah, and we know the economy. I'm a small business owner, and the economy in the last 4 years has been really tough to make any money. So if these businesses are in the same boat that a lot of my entrepreneur and business owner friends are in, very narrow margins right now, something like this could very well be devastating to mom and pop and small business owners, and that is sad. Um, that's very concerning. So yeah, I appreciate the fact that you bring that up, and we should all encourage people to get up there and visit those businesses and help them out. I heard you say cookie, so happy to stop in and grab a chocolate chip cookie on my way by when I'm
Yeah,
up there.
the Jacob Lake Inn is known for their cookies and they're popular with
Yeah,
the hunters, but they
yeah,
certainly can use your support right now.
no doubt. That's a great point, and thank you for mentioning that. I'm looking at these maps, and so that area, as you know, and you've kind of alluded to, mentioned that this area is used to burning. Um, a lot of fires down here from '03 to 14 and so on and so forth. So just an area that must get hit by lightning on a pretty regular basis. I noticed I've got a fire service background. You and I talked about it. Um, I know that in a lot of these wildfires, they generally burn along with prevailing winds, which go from the southwest to the northeast. And in a lot of fires, you see that curvature, you see that direction. This fire is interesting in that it burned almost due north for almost the entirety of that fire. There is some eastern expansion as well, which you would expect, but a very distinct northern burn pattern. So you've got an opinion on that, you said.
Yeah. So, we very much are focused on the Dragon Bravo fires. I think we should be. But at the same time, or just leading into the Dragon Bravo fire, there was the White Sage fire. And the White Sage fire took that more normal direction that you would expect with a fire. So why the difference for the Dragon Bravo fire?
Mm.
And to understand that, I think we really got to look at the topography. So when the fire started to the west of the lodge, it was behaving as you would expect with kind of that eastward expansion and a northward expansion. But as it crossed Highway 67 and it approached the park boundary, the firemen were able to take advantage of some of the topography and some of the lay of the land, but also the trees. So just inside the park, there's a large meadow. Folks that may travel to the North Rim can probably remember passing through the check station to enter the park. And then immediately upon entering a meadow, you often see bison there along the side of the highway. Because of that meadow, they were able to help push the fire to the east and try to help control it. And they had a plan. They had a very nice fire break built along the boundary of the park on the east side of the highway along the 610 road. And the hope was they'd be able to stop it there. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. It crossed the 610 road and it continued to march north. But because they had channeled the fire to the east side of the highway, and the majority of the highway has meadows that meander along the highway between
Mm-hmm.
Jacobs Lake and the North Rim, they were able to keep the fire on that side, and that helped them fight the fire. As it traveled through the Saddle Mountain Wilderness and down through the Coxcombs, it burned its way down through and went out as it entered previous burn scars, but also as the vegetation type changed as you dropped in elevation. As the fire traveled north through 12A East, adjacent to the highway, there were some dicey days there where it was trying to take out the Kaibab Lodge. And there's a gas station there, and that's obviously not good. Mixing a fire and a fuel station is not good. But they were able to protect that infrastructure. And as the fire traveled north, they were very aggressively trying to push the fire off of the rim and get it into that lower country. And they were fighting every place they could, build a fire break to try to stop and push the fire to the side. And they did a great job with that. And as it approached the scar from the Warm Springs fire from, about 20 years ago, it changed in fuel type and they were able to push the fire up behind Cane Ranch, and then it traveled out towards House Rock, and
Right.
it dwindled in fuels and they were able to get a control of it.
Mm-hmm.
But very much that fire was kind of trapped on the east side of the highway, and it burnt north. It did go to the east as well through the Coxcombs, but as you travel further north, the forest gets very narrow there before it drops off the cliff and the fuel type changes. And that's why the fire traveled in that type of format.
Yeah. Thoughts on you've been attending all the updates and whatnot. You mentioned I think we touched on erosion, but I don't think we really dove into it. What are you hearing or seeing, and what do you think are going to be the effects of all this vegetation has been burned off? We always have floods and a lot of runoff. Any thoughts on that, particularly how it's going to impact hunters this fall?
So when you look at closures, hunters tend to go, well, this part burnt and that part didn't, so I can be here. But they don't always think about the other reaching impacts of the fire scar. And if you look at how the Kaibab's laid out, a lot of 12A East is going to drop off to the east. And I would expect that if you're downslope to the east of the areas that burnt, they're going to be concerned about letting the public in there. Because if you have a rain event and you have mudslides or other erosion that can be quite catastrophic, you don't want people down below that. We've all seen what happens when you have flash flooding and things, and then you compound that with erosion and debris washed out of a fire scar. It's not going to be good. So I would consider that most of the areas that have burnt catastrophically, if you're downstream of that, those areas are definitely going to remain closed. I would anticipate for quite a while until it's safe to re-enter those.
Yeah.
I believe they'll do what they can to try to stabilize those soil types. They'll do reseeds and different things like that. They've just barely done the assessments post-fire of the fire severity, so we finally have a map to kind of study that. And I know there's experts in the community on some of the hiking forums that have done a very deep technical analysis of how they expect that to erode and where the danger areas are. But there's some challenges that the agencies are facing. In the past, they've used different seed types that are natural seeds to reseed those areas. Even though they've bought certified seeds, they were telling us to the public meeting that a lot of the certified seeds weren't truly the correct type of seed. So they're reluctant to disperse those seeds again because it can
Mm,
spread things like cheatgrass and other things you don't want on the landscape.
mm.
And they don't have a
Invasive,
solution for that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm,
And so I think there's some real challenges there if you're downslope of, those fire scars like around the coxcombs and, down into the park. But even as you travel further north onto the forest lands south of the BLM land in House Rock Valley, those may be staying closed longer than you would expect because of the danger of erosion. And the public meetings is a great place to get some of that information. Even if you can't attend in person, those public meetings are broadcast on the social media platforms. They're recorded and you can go back and listen to them afterwards. There's been two different meetings. Um, there's been meetings in Fredonia because the community is affected, and there's been meetings in Page. And each time they've done that meeting, they'll do the first night in Fredonia and the second night in Page. There's been two sets of meetings so far since the Dragon Bravo started. And the last one was about a week ago. The one before that was about a week before that.
so you might be due for another update.
Yeah, I anticipate that they'll have more updates. It's hard to say exactly what the cadence of those meetings will be because they need something to communicate to the community. I think as the BEAR team, which is the acronym for the After Fire Action Team that comes in and assesses the impact and what they're going to do about it, as that team gets more information and builds a plan, I suspect that that's going to be communicated to the public. Whether that will be in the format of such a formal meeting or if it'll be online remains to be seen. But certainly, any of those types of meetings are worth attending and valuable. We very much have focused a lot today on talking about the Forest Service, but there's an opportunity here to approach the Game and Fish Department. And I would encourage hunters to reach out to them when they have questions and seek information, but also get involved in, these fires are getting more common and they're getting more devastating. What can we do as a community to push for different fire management practices and different forest management practices to lessen the impact of these fires on the resource and on the community?
Russ, I know you were talking earlier about burn severity. You made a comment. It might have been offline that it was this fire was appropriately named the Dragon Fire. Do you know where the name came from? Usually, the fires come from the seed of the fire. Where they start? A creek name or a meadow name.
Yeah.
What was the Dragon Bravo?
So if you look adjacent to the lodge to the west, there's an area there where the word dragon is common. There's
Dragon
Dragon
Head. Yeah,
Head, Dragon
yeah.
Canyon, there's some springs, and that very much is where the name came from.
Okay.
And we thought it was appropriate. Fire breathing dragon was
Yeah.
definitely the explanation of what this happened
So
here with this fire. And as they were getting ready to put it, in the last days of it's certainly not out all the way out, but for all intents and purposes is pretty much out. And we were staring at the satellite imagery. And if you look at Dragon Head, the head of the dragon, the fire was burning right there. And I even think I put on social media, let's chop the head off this dragon and get this over with.
So you witnessed a lot of this fire activity in person, um, and you mentioned, this whole incident and this fire and the destruction is very personal to you and your family. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to see this in person.
Well, when the fire first started, we were on a buffalo hunt, the July buffalo hunt, and we were having good success and really enjoying ourselves, and we're excited about the days ahead. And then there were a couple of lightning strikes. It wasn't much for moisture, but we certainly got the lightning strikes. The white sage fire kicked off, and that's certainly concerning to us, but we live and work in these communities, and we've had that type of event happen before. So, we were concerned, but we're watching the wind direction and like we're good. Okay. Then they worry about being able to evacuate the public. So at first they were in a ready state within the park, but as the fire progressed, they evacuated the park and kicked everyone off the park. And they started closing the forest. And when that happened, we actually got an exemption, which is not uncommon for those once in a lifetime tags. If we're able to safely conduct the hunt, a lot of times the Forest Service will allow that to continue. Unfortunately, very soon after the exemption was issued, the exemption was retracted. And so you had once in a lifetime buffalo type hunts running, and hunters were literally kicked off the forest. And it's super tragic for the hunters that still had another week in their season and were excited about how things were going to lose that. And for us, that's very personable. You develop these close relationships with the hunters, and you're working very diligently to help them fulfill a very difficult dream of harvesting a free range bison. And then to watch the fire burning down an area and a land that you love and you're intimately familiar with, it certainly has an impact that's long lasting. But there's also those personal relationships and then the impact that it has to those hunters. It just breaks your heart. But what do you do? And so we pick up and move out. And that was tragic. We got the word to go, and 3 hours later, we were off the Kaibab. It's easy for me to say those words, but if you look at what we had to pull off, there were 9 trucks, 7 trailers, mules, equipment off the Kaibab in 3 hours. And we're proud that we're able to pull that off, but it's stressful, it's expensive, it has an impact to our business, but it has impacts to the hunters and that they lost those times and they might not see those tags again for another 20 or so years. And some of the
Yeah.
hunters aren't that young. So it's just devastating the impact that it has on a
Right.
personal level, but also in the community. And it's tragic and it just breaks your heart.
Yeah. It's extremely, extremely unfortunate. And you were talking earlier about, all the work that has to be done now. You were talking specifically about the 67, the main corridor, the main thoroughfare through there, and the hazards of trees coming down and whatnot. But I imagine that same danger and that same threat extends to all those trails in the forest, all
It
those
does.
forest roads. So
Yeah.
I know they've got heavy equipment in there now. We've seen lots of photos, big equipment. But man, that's going to take weeks, if not months, to
Yeah.
clear that and make it safe for humans to be out there traveling on those roads again, right?
It does. And I
Yeah.
don't think the public fully appreciates how big a job that is. Certainly, they've got some of the best working on it, and they're working on it in a safe but in diligent manner. But it's going to take time, and it doesn't happen overnight. Um, the financial implications. I've read about the numbers here. The park budget, I believe, is around 22 million a year, and more than a week ago, the fire was 3 times the park's annual budget just to fight the fire. And we hadn't even got into remediation and reclamation and the other things that have to happen. So there's a financial impact here that's huge.
Yeah.
And where do those
Massive.
resources come from? And how long is it before it's safe to go into those areas? And how much time do you have before winter snows hit? And so on and so forth. So, um, certainly within the catastrophic fire scar, don't be surprised if it's slower to open than some of the adjacent areas. But it's not just those fire hazards on the main thoroughfares with the tree hazards coming down. There's the hazards of where they've put in those dozer lines and other barriers to the fire. Those all have to be reclamated. And you're talking dozens of miles of forest that they have to go through and finish what they started and put it back into a more natural state so that those don't erode. And that's going to take time. I know that they are aware of what's happening with the hunters. I think the area that you see open is a direct response to the Forest Service understanding that and opening as much as they could feel safe in doing. We've had lots of conversations with the leaders that make these decisions. They were at the public meetings. They listen to what you have to say and they're doing the best they can for you. But it's just an unfortunate situation that has impacts that nobody wants, but are a reality of what happens when you have these types of events.
Yeah. Let's recap. I think you said in the beginning, no loss of life in this fire, right? I haven't seen that reported
Correct.
anywhere. No,
Correct.
probably some injuries here and there to the guys who are working on the front lines, no doubt, but no loss of life. And for the most part, what's your take on how this has been managed personally? Any thoughts on that?
You know, it's tough. It's easy to lay blame and second guess things with
Sure.
hindsight, and I prefer not to do that.
Yeah.
What I like to focus on is trying to be positive. People that know me will recognize that about Russ Jacoby. He tries to be positive. What can we do better in the future? For me, if I turn on any of the popular apps and you look at the fire history and the current fires, um, they seem to be increasing in intensity and size. And I think the reason for that is if you look at the history, for a long time, we had logging on the Kaibab. That changed around the 80s, and there's lots of videos online that you can look at where people talk about that. And I think that that's a good thing for people to do to get educated. But something changed at that time with the spotted owls and an environmental movement. They changed to like let nature take its course. And for me personally, I think that's part of the problem. Um, there's a lot of lawsuits that happen to stop thinning and other positive things to the
Right.
forest that are trying to restore it to a more natural state.
Hmm.
When that happens, when we have a fire, I don't call it a man. It's not a natural fire. It's a man-made bonfire. It's happening because we artificially suppressed and created a fuel load that's not sustainable in the forest. You have lots of jack pines and just down and dead debris, and the trees are too thick and choked and they're not healthy. You get a lightning strike, some dry conditions, and they just spreads. And that's not normal. That's not natural. That's not what's supposed to happen in the forest. So I would encourage people to get involved and lobby and insist on we change our forest management practices. We need to do a better job of restoring our forest to where they're more resilient to these events when they happen. When those events happen, we need to be able to withstand those. But I care about animals and trees as much as anybody, but I wouldn't call myself an extremist or an environmentalist. And I think we need more balance. We tend to be so far extremes in this country to one end or the other, and I think we need to meet in the middle. So when we have forest management practices that are very skewed to one side with don't touch it, let nature take its course, that's not working. And we can't mow down every tree. Let's meet in the middle. Let's have a forest that's healthy. There's a good mix of old trees and younger trees and mature trees. Let's have logging. Let's have some logging, okay? Because your choices are not let nature just do her own thing. Like that's not clearly working. When you just let
Right.
nature do her own thing after decades of fire suppression, we have this catastrophic fire. Then you have nothing left. And I don't think anybody wants that.
Yeah.
One of the things I like to try to impress on people is you don't get to pick the consequences. The consequences are based on the choices you make. So let's make better choices so that we have better consequences. This is harsh to say, but is it unfair to say that we want this to happen? Well, we do because we keep managing in a way that causes this to happen. Now, I don't mean people really want it to happen, but it's happening because of the choices we're making. Let's make better choices so the consequences are ones that we all will like better. And I'm super passionate about that. I don't want
Yeah.
to offend anybody or anything like that, but come on, let's step back. Let's put our personal opinions in and personal, what do you call it? Like opinions aside, and let's look at facts. Let's look at
It, it's
what
idealism,
happens and
right?
let's behave differently. Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, ideally, the forest gets to just exist naturally, but um, that's not practical when human beings live in the forest and human beings recreate in the forest. So you're right. There's got to be balance. I live in the burn scar of the Rodeo Chesky fire. 500,000 acres burned. At the time was the largest fire in Arizona history. The town of Heber, where I live in, was devastated by that fire. And I can recall after this fire along the 260 highway, um, at least one billboard, if not a couple, screaming about the environmental lists, right? So every all good people, all good people on both sides of the issue, but there's idealism getting in the way. And ideally, yeah, the forest gets to run its course and it gets to exist naturally, but not when there's humans around and human lives and infrastructure are threatened. We can do a better job of managing. You're right. And right now, the forest is largely managed by those special interests, those environmentalists. And that's
Yeah,
where a lot
and
of policy comes from, right?
from a financial impact, every one of those trees could have been used in a positive way for
It's a renewable
society.
resource, and it's a renewable
Right.
resource. So it all could have been
Sure.
used and for very, very useful purposes, and it's 100% renewable. There'll be new trees here in years to come.
But
Um,
now what's happened is look at the Warm Springs burn. Even 20 years later, it's not recovered. Like
yeah,
there's plants there and there's
right,
aspen trees, but it
right,
doesn't look like it did before the fire.
right,
And it won't in my lifetime look like it did
mhm,
before.
right.
It won't in my grandchildren's lifetime look like that. Well, I'm not okay with that. I would rather us manage our forests to maintain what they should be longer term. And we certainly want fire in the landscape. We need fire in the landscape. But the fires in the landscape need to be a sustainable, renewable fire. These
Manageable.
these forests are not managed properly and they're catastrophic, devastating fires that destroy the forest. It doesn't renew or cleanse the forest, it destroys it. And that's what I'm lobbying for. I'm lobbying for,
Burns too hot, and
yeah,
then destroys the forest.
yeah,
So where I'm at in the east side of the rim, massive logging operation launched, maybe going back 6, 7, 8 years ago, maybe when this was initiated. Now, mind you, that was nearly 20 some odd years after Rodeo Chesky.
yep.
So devastating fire, devastated this community of Hebrew Overguard, and it still took 20 plus years for somebody to allow loggers to go in. And that forest is, uh, after the logging, it's beautiful. The forest is beautiful. It's recovered in a very lovely, natural, beautiful way. And the communities of Forest Lakes and some surrounding communities are so much safer today. That fire will be forced to the ground. It'll be a grass fire and it'll be much more manageable. So I agree with you 1,000%. There's got to be a compromise. We've got to be able to come together and have more responsible management of the forest. With that,
Paul,
I do. Yeah, go ahead.
I mentioned something about Jacobs Lake, and I want to talk about that just for a minute as we're
Yeah, go
talking
ahead.
about how to make fires more or forests more sustainable. I invite anyone to drive the main road that goes into the forest, the 461 road just south of Jacobs Lake, and look to the north. Look at the trees there. Just look at them. They're a mile from Jacobs Lake, and ask yourself if a fire happens right here, what's going to happen to Jacobs Lake? In the last 10 years, I can't count how many times we've prayed, please don't burn down Jacob's Lake. I believe in acting like it depends on us and praying like it depends on the Lord. Okay? We are not acting like it depends on us. When you drive that road and you look at that forest, when it catches fire, is going to take out the lodge and they're not going to be able to stop it. Why are we as a community not out there insisting that we thin that portion of the forest to protect those types of resources? Now, I'm not saying they don't do anything, they do, but it's not enough. It's nowhere near enough to make these communities and the areas resilient to fire. If you look at the map of what has and hasn't burned, there's only a small portion of the Kaibab left now that hasn't burned. And the area that we care about is in that patch.
Hmm.
It's between the entrance to the park and Fire Point. There's about 15 miles of fence line there between the park and the forest.
Hmm.
And if that catches fire, instead of you and I having a podcast talking about how they kept it on one side of the highway,
Right.
it's going to muck out the other side of the highway from the park boundary all the way to Jacobs Lake. And now is the time to prevent that. And the only way to prevent that is to go into that entire patch of forest and get aggressive about cleaning it up so that it can be a resilient forest. If we don't do that, what's going to happen is you and I are going to be talking about how sad it is that we lost that patch of dirt.
That's a great point. And, we used to say a lot in the fire service, if it's predictable, it's preventable. So to your point, this
Yep.
is predictable and
Yep.
therefore it is preventable. So we could be taking steps right now to create fire breaks or thin, whatever needs to be done, whatever is determined to be appropriate to save that beautiful forest and the human infrastructure that is inevitably in its way. Russ, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been
Hey,
very, very good discussion.
no, I appreciate you having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to get the word out there. For the folks that do choose to do their hunts this year, we wish them well. Good luck on your hunts. There's some amazing resource there. Take advantage of it. For the folks that are going to, quote, kick the can down the road and try again in the future, I totally understand that perspective. And I hope that you're able to do that and this doesn't happen again, because that would be really unfortunate.
Agreed. Brief shout out to the U.S. Forest Service and especially the men and women on the front lines fighting this thing. Um, I'm a pretty big fan of the upper brass of the U.S. Forest Service. These incident management teams. I don't know if you know, but following 9/11 and the chaos that was created following 9/11, it was the U.S. Forest Service that actually came into New York City and reorganized their entire command structure. So these as the New York City firefighters told me once, these guys in funny green pants came in, but they lined out the rest of that incident from an incident management perspective. They lined out and set up that whole command structure for FDNY and helped them move forward in a more efficient manner. I got to witness it firsthand following the Granite Mountain fire that killed the 19 firefighters. I was in the command post for 2 weeks with the Forest Service, and they took over what was, a chaotic incident initially, and ran that entire thing, and super, super impressed with their abilities to manage major incidents like this. So shout out to the Forest Service, especially the men and women on the front lines. I'm very thankful we haven't had any loss of life. I'm sure there's been some injuries here and there, but no major injuries reported. So all in all, that's a good thing. There's a bright spot in all of this. Russ, thank you again for joining me today. You mentioned that you're going to continue to post updates on this and other events affecting that part of the world. How can people find you online?
So we have a Facebook community, and if you look up Arizona bison hunting, there's a Facebook page there. And we post content that would be applicable to anyone with any type of permit on the Kaibab. And any questions the community has, I will do my very best to get those answered and get the information out there. So we encourage people to go check that out. It's a nice community. There's a lot of positive stuff on there. We did daily, multiple posts a day during the fire. So you can look back at the history there and see what was going on if you're interested. And we get a lot of requests for folks that had the deer hunt or the antelope hunt, and they reach out to us because they know we're there all the time and we're there before those other hunts happen. So that's one of the best ways to get involved and understand what's going on.
Well, Russ Jacoby, you are the go-to guy for anything going on in that part of the world up there on the Kaibab. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining me on short notice. This was very, very informative. I appreciate your perspective on everything. So thanks again for joining me.
Paul, is a pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
You bet. Everyone, this is the Bloodline Podcast by Precision Hunting Supply. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.